and to help share information and support for gifted families. And how we do that, we help gifted students by providing school-specific materials for the class, recognized as one of the 25 most influential psychologists nationally on gifted education. We are so grateful that his plane is getting some maintenance work in Newton and that he could drive up to Kansas City and visit with us tonight. That was excellent. He has written 16 books, some of which you will see down here. The rest of these are represented from your publishing company, is that correct? All of them down here are available for sale, and our happy BB Page reps down there will help you with cash, checks, and charge, I think, right? Okay, so if you're interested afterwards, you can look at these books and purchase them over on the table. Also, thank you. In the first presentation, Dr. Webb offered to email anyone his set of slides. Are you still willing to do that? Thank you. And we have sheets over there on the table. If you would like to leave your email address, we will have those sent to you. There's also a place where if you're interested in being on the BB Page mailing list, we would be happy to add you to that so that you can get our emails. I promise we do not over-email. We try not to. Only one a month comes from us, so it won't be too torturous for you. Dr. Webb also in 1981 established the SANG, which stands for Supporting Emotional Needs of Gifted Children. And I hope he will share a little bit more about that process and a little bit more about the experience. And I said earlier tonight, and I'm standing by it, that I think despite all, or not despite, but in addition to all of his accreditation and accolades in an academic arena, one of the things that's most impressive to me is that he is here and still standing with all of his hair. He is the father of 6 daughters. So he has been there and done that. So without further
Thank you. Yeah, that is probably my biggest credential for you tonight. It's not that I'm a psychologist or an author. It's that I'm a parent. My wife and I do have 6 daughters, and we have them every possible way you can have a daughter. You know, interestingly, we lost our overhead again, or our projector. But we have daughters every possible way you can have daughters other than test tube. I have 1 biological, 2 adopted, 2-step, and 1 niece daughter. My brother died when she was 13 and she functionally became a daughter, so we have 6 daughters. And I can tell you that we are successes as parents, which means our children are alive and currently out of jail. I also, though, in all seriousness, need to say that we are lucky parents, too. Because I have seen parents who, as far as I could tell, had done all the right things, and their kids were not alive or out of jail. There are some things that, as parents, as much as we try to control, it's beyond our control. And I'm saying that in case there are folks out there who are having tough times with that. Know that I do understand. I'm delighted to see such a turnout tonight. This was kind of a fortuitous event, one of those serendipitous events. I'm a pilot, and I fly an old 1963 Piper Comanche, and I flew myself to Indianapolis to the National Association for Gifted Children, but knowing that I was going to fly over here, and knowing a fair number of folks here now, I kind of put out the word and said, you know, I'm on my way back, dropping off my plane in Newton, Kansas, and some of you probably even know where that is. And it would be easy for me to rent a car and come over and do a workshop if it's interesting to you. And they said, yes. So this afternoon, I spent a couple of hours with teachers and administrators. And tonight, I'm understanding that most of you are here as parents. How many are here primarily as parents? Oh, wonderful. You're my most favorite group to talk to. The teachers, they behaved, we were okay. But you're my preferred group because, and I did tell them this, Over the years that I've been working in this field, I have become convinced that parents are simply more important in the long-term outcome of gifted children than our teachers. Not that teachers are unimportant, I'm sure not saying that, but what I'm saying is how many times I have seen when parents understood, were informed, guided, nurtured, supported gifted children. Good parenting like that could pretty regularly overcome mediocre, poor, or even awful teaching. But the reverse isn't so. Teaching, no matter how good it is, can seldom overcome mediocre, uninformed, or poor parenting, and you know that. But there's another reason that makes it even more persuasive for me. And that is how many times parents of gifted children tell me what a lonely experience it has been for them, and still is. They tell me a common set of experiences that go like this, that even when their child was really young, they recognize that their child seemed to be different than the other children. Their child seemed to be a little bit advanced, or maybe a lot advanced on developmental milestones. Their child seemed unusually intense and reacted a lot to stimuli. Their child seemed curious about things and asked a lot of questions and maybe learned to read or do mathematics early. And so what the parents tell me that they did was they would talk about this with other parents who would say, every mother has a gifted child, you know. Or why are you putting so much pressure on your child? Making your child read and write before entering school is just stressful and going to be harmful to his mental health and put him out of step with the other kids. And you scratched your head and said, I didn't think I put pressure. I just answered a few questions and bang, there it was. Or you notice that your child seemed quirky in some ways. You notice that other parents didn't talk about having to cut the tags out of the back of their shirts. Or that their children were so picky about certain foods, or textures, or tastes. So you went to the pediatrician. Surely that's where you would get some answers to what's going on with my child, and is this normal? And the pediatrician, after he or she explained to the child how the stethoscope worked, the pediatrician said, you got a bright child here, and what do I do with him? Well, I don't know, just follow his lead and love him. Well, you were going to do that anyway. Now, why I'm saying this, highlighting this, is because I hate to tell you this, but regrettably, you are not going to necessarily be able to count on the professionals that you should be able to count on. Pediatricians, family practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors typically get zero training about gifted children. And frankly, by the time we get through this evening, you will know more about characteristics of gifted children than most healthcare and counseling professionals. It's a regrettable situation. We're working very, very hard to try and correct it. The we, in this case, being SANG, Supporting Emotional Needs of Gifted, that was mentioned at the outset. We're working with the American Academy of Pediatrics and working with the American Psychological Association. And it's because of the lack of information. That's why so many gifted children are being incorrectly diagnosed as ADHD, Asperger's, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar, and the like. And we'll talk more about that later. I'm delighted you're here, parents. You're my most favorite group to talk to because you're the most important, but yet you have the least sources of information. And it's the same model parent groups that I hope will be particularly helpful to you. We created those, we started those back in 1981. Oh, that's a long time ago. But the same, I was a college professor in Ohio at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. And there was a young, I'll give you the short version of it, a young computer whiz kid who went to college, Michigan State University at age 16, and after a few weeks he disappeared. No one could find him. There was speculation that he had been really involved in Dungeons and Dragons, which were all the rage back then, and somehow something bad had happened. His parents hired a private detective who found this young man working in the oil fields in Louisiana as a gopher. Not a happy camper. And they brought this young man back home, hooked him up with a psychiatrist who had no training about gifted. And after a few weeks, this young man committed suicide. He shot himself. I never knew this young man, but after his death, his parents contacted me through a mutual friend and said, where in the country is there a place that focuses on social, emotional, family needs of gifted kids? I thought, I don't know. I asked around, and the people who should know didn't know. We all knew of lots of places that focused on the educational aspects of gifted children, the schooling, the academics, but not on social, emotional. And the prevailing notion was they don't have any particular social and emotional needs that are different than any other kid. Well, it clearly wasn't the case for this situation. And so I talked to Dr. and Mrs. Egbert, the parents of this young man, and we agreed to start a little program there at Wright State University that, frankly, I thought would be very small. My dean and I talked it over, and we agreed that we thought it would be in a corner or a closet or a back room. But we agreed that we'd let it grow as big as it seemed like it warranted. A few months later, I got a call from Dr. and Mrs. Egbert, and they said the Phil Donahue Show had contacted them, and they were doing a national show on TV on gifted children and depression and suicide. They had agreed to be on, provided that first we could talk about this new program we had started called SANG, and secondly, that I would be on with them. I thought, well, that's interesting. I've never been on national television before, but okay. So I went, and it was incredible, electric happening. There were 6 other families from around the country, all of whom had gifted children, where they were either involved in major power struggles, or the child had attempted suicide, or committed suicide, or thought about suicide. What was even more astonishing was after the show, over 20,000 letters came in from across the country, the most that the Phil Donahue Show had for any show that year. And the letters were uniform, saying, yes, there's a need, no, there's not a program anywhere in the country that we know of. So I went to my dean and said, we've got really a major thing that needs to be done here, and we really put some effort behind SANG. The effort that we put was to form SANG model parent groups, to give parents a place where they could come and talk with other parents of gifted children about, what's your kid like? Really? What have you tried? How did it work? We called it Sharing Parenting Recipes. We told the parents up front, I don't have all the answers to how you should raise your child. Depends on the child's temperament. It depends on a whole bunch of things. I have some information I'll share with you where I can. But what we want to do is lay out a smorgasbord and let you choose and pick things to try. And I'm hoping that's what you will get from tonight. That you will get one or two, maybe even three, new ideas tonight that you can take home and try. If so, it will be worthwhile. I do have to, though, do as Paul Harvey used to do and tell you the rest of the story on this. And that is, the research indicates that gifted children as a group are no more likely than children in general to think about or commit suicide. Well, not to think, to commit suicide. I always tell people I find that not very comforting, because if you think about it, being bright, supposedly that means you're able to solve problems, and you should be less likely. So just being as likely is not very comforting. There is, however, one subgroup of gifted children that is more likely, and that's the highly profoundly gifted children, if they're not being understood at home and school. These are gifted children who, well, the book that I have here is it that I just finished. It's called Searching for Meaning, Bright Minds, Idealism, Disillusionment, and Hope. Bright minds, the idealists, often get disillusioned. Some of them get mired in depression. Hopefully we can help them find hope. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is to go through what I consider to be the 11 most important issues for you as parents, and if there are educators out there, the information is somewhat different than what I talked to you about. Maybe you'll find it interesting too. And I'm going to try to leave time at the end for questions. So let me get my clicker and take off my jacket. Let's get at it. And then again, maybe not. I told the teachers earlier today that when I was in university, we had a saying that if you steal ideas from one person, it's called plagiarism. But if you steal from two or more people, it's called research. And these are the books that I am stealing most of my ideas from. And they're books that are over here. I thought my problem was just a bad battery early, but apparently it's not. And one of these books has a, it's interesting. One of these books has a quote. That's fascinating. I have a challenge here. see if it comes up as it should. The PowerPoints were conflicting with each other. Yep, just give it a minute here. The resources. And from one of the books, I wanted to share with you something that you probably are pretty familiar with, that parenting a gifted child is like living in a theme park full of thrill rides. Sometimes you smile, sometimes you gasp, sometimes you scream, sometimes you laugh, sometimes you gaze in wonder and astonishment. Sometimes you're frozen in your seat, sometimes you're proud, and sometimes the ride is so nerve-wracking you can't do anything but cry. One of the central themes in what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the intensity of gifted children. That's probably the single most universal characteristic and yet the most overlooked characteristic. One mother told me, and I always quote her, she said, "My child's life motto is anything worth doing is worth doing to excess." And they are excessive personalities. If they're into dinosaurs, that's all they want to do. If they're into chess, they eat, sleep, drink, breathe, live chess. If they're into power struggles or sibling rivalry, it's equally as intensely. They even sleep more intensely than other children. That sounds strange, but parents tell me they know what I'm talking about, that when these kids are asleep, they're more soundly asleep. Their dreams are more vivid. And in the case of, some of them have actually night terrors, they're so soundly asleep. In the case of boys, there's a higher incidence of bedwetting and sleepwalking, apparently because they're so soundly asleep. As you parent these kids, I want you also to keep in mind that are we preparing our children for college or for life? My take on it is that we need to keep looking at the broader picture rather than just college. Now, college is nice and in fact necessary depending on what professions you want to go into. But the longer I've lived, the more I've come to understand and see a lot of folks who were college dropouts, who ended up being very successful. And of course, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak are two examples. Bill Gates is another. Warren Buffett is another. There are a whole bunch of them that didn't finish college, took the non-traditional path. I also want to spend just a minute or two talking about what do you mean by gifted? And by the way, I should tell you, as I did with the teachers, I apologize for using the term gifted. I don't like the term. I don't like it because it does a very poor job of describing who these children are. And I also know what a turnoff it is to so many parents, educators, administrators, even the kids themselves. I use it reluctantly because it's a term that's in the literature and the research these days. It'll probably change. I'm sure it will. I've been a psychologist long enough to see how terms change in the field. But in the interim, I encourage people to think about using other terms. I think bright is better, talented is better, rapid learner, high potential. Any of those carries less of the emotional baggage. But I hope you'll tonight at least understand that I'm using the term reluctantly. The term giftedness, what do we mean by it? Well, way back in 1972, the U.S. Department of Education said gifted children are children who show unusual ability or potential for ability in any one or more of 5 areas: intellect, academics, creativity, leadership, or visual or performing arts, and originally they had psychomotor. That's gifted athletes. And there are gifted athletes, but now that's been deleted because athletes are pretty well taken care of. And if I look at these, I find this is interesting and helpful, but I recognize that schools really focus on the first two. That's what we have required our schools to do. They don't do much with creativity. As a matter of fact, there are some aspects of schooling that inhibit creativity. Leadership, not much. Maybe student government. Visual performing arts, band, maybe an art class. I'm mentioning these three particularly because as parents, you're going to have to pick up the slack if your child falls in those three areas. One of the parts of why I don't like the term gifted is because it implies that they're all the same. You look at the research literature and it'll say 20 gifted children were compared with 20 non-gifted children, and I find myself rolling my eyes. Well, 20, like it's an either-or thing, you're gifted, he's not. No, it's not an either-or. Gifted in what area, what kind, to what degree, what flavor. And at least back in 1963, a psychologist named Elizabeth Drews said there are at least 4 kinds of gifted children. The first are the high achievers. Those are the stereotypic gifted children. And my friend George Betts calls them the teacher pleaser kind of gifted. Then you have the social leaders. These are the ones who are the quarterback of the football team, or the head of student government, or the lead in the play, and they're the ones who set the social tone in the school. Then you have the creative intellectuals. These are the ones who get real creative with teachers' lessons plans, and the teachers don't necessarily appreciate them. Now the other kids love them, but the teachers don't know how to take these kids. And then you have the nonconformist rebels. These are ones who, any authority, they feel duty-bound to rebel against. It's like the old Marlon Brando line from On the Waterfront, where someone said, "What are you rebelling against?" "What do you got?" You can have gifted children who fit in any of these 4 categories. And all too many, I find in the nonconformist rebels, particularly those who come from socially disenfranchised groups, or where there is a strong power struggle at home. But the way we have most often identified gifted children is academically or on some test, and usually defined it as the upper 3%, the far green up there. And that's handy, but it really doesn't do justice to gifted children. And I talked to the teachers earlier today. There's some very good research suggesting that we really should define gifted as the upper 10%, which falls between the 115 and the 130, right about 120 IQ. Some very good brain research on that. And I'll go back into this in a minute with some characteristics, but first I want to talk about some of the particular issues that are most common amongst gifted children, because that's what you're here for tonight. The first is boredom. Research indicates that most gifted children in the regular classroom, from 1/4 to 1/2 of the regular classroom time is spent waiting for others to catch up. Most gifted children can tell you how many times their teacher cleared her throat. How many times she said, well, don't you know? The boredom. They are underachieving by 2 to 4 grade levels below what they could comfortably achieve at. Tied in with this is underachievement. And I had a couple of good friends of mine, Betsy McCoach and Del Segley, who introduced me to the notion that we are teaching our gifted children to underachieve in the primary grades. That really made my eyebrows go up. So what do you mean? He said, it goes like this, that in your parent-teacher conference, you go in and the teacher says, Miss Harrison, your daughter is so delightful. I wish I had a class full of kids just like her. She's getting 100s on all the tests. She never questions me, never causes any problems. She does everything I ask her to do. She's a delight. You have nothing to worry about. Yes, you do. You have something to worry about. What you have to worry about, first of all, is she's getting 100s on every test. Because she's being deprived of the opportunity to learn some life skills that are terribly important. Frustration tolerance, stress management, resilience. What happens with these kids is they just go diddly-bopping along, not being challenged until about 5th or 6th grade, and then for the first time, they're challenged. They hit a wall and they fragment because they never learned this. We taught them to underachieve. Please be careful if your kid is coming home with 100s, 100s, 100s. Peer issues. This is close to a universal issue. Think about who's a peer for a gifted child, and you have to say, well, a peer in what? You mean a peer in terms of chess, or do you mean a peer in terms of t-ball? Do you mean a peer in terms of math or music, or do you mean a peer in terms of something else? What I'm saying is often these kids need several different peer groups. And even though there are 25 kids in the class, they're not necessarily going to find a peer in their area of expertise or interest right now. What you find, too, is they characteristically gravitate toward older playmates or adults, which is wonderful because finally I have someone that is interested in fractals. I mean, fractals are wonderful, aren't they? And I find someone I can share that interest. However, I'm going to come back to that, and I'll foreshadow the very last one. One of the problems with that, though, is their judgment lags behind their intellect. But we'll come back to that. Feelings of belongingness ties right in with peers. I don't feel understood in this classroom with my peers, even on the playground. I was on the baseball field, I was talking about the epigee and apogee of the baseball as it went out, and they looked at me funny. Anger, another common one, particularly power struggles. And I was telling the teachers earlier today, it's ironic to me that the parents I see who are most likely to be in the power struggles are the ones that care the most. Now, isn't that ironic? But I understand it, because if you're a parent who cares, you want your child to live up to his potential. And you push, and you nudge, and you shove, and it's wonderful. And that's what you should be doing. If you're a parent, you should be nudging your child. I don't care if you like your video game. We are going to the ballet. We are going to the art museum. I'm going to insist that my child have experiences that otherwise that child would never have unless I insisted. That's part of our job description. On the other hand, as we'll talk about in a minute, these kids are, this is going to be a surprise to you, but gifted children are strong-willed. And so you push, and they're strong-willed, and you get in a power struggle. The question then arises, how much do you push, and when do you back off? And how do you know when to do which? And it's a tough question because, well, it varies with the child's temperament, but also the right answer with this child one day isn't necessarily the right answer the next day. I can only give you a general guideline, and that is, I want you to push. I want you to nudge, to expose the children. But if it gets to the point where you're running a risk of seriously jeopardizing your relationship with the child, then it's time to back off. Because the one thing that you have that you cannot afford to lose is your relationship, the communication. Everything I know about the successful long-term outcome of gifted children says it's that relationship with one or two adults that is life-alteringly important. So the power struggles. Now, even that, if that means that they're going to fail. And when I say that, parents typically, their eyes get really big and they get white in the face and they say, oh my gosh, I can't give that up. That's too important. And what I tell them is, you're not giving up much of anything because you didn't have anything there to begin with. You can make a kid sit in his room in the presence of his books, but you can't make him score an A on the test. It's something about horses and water and drinking, you know. What's the saying? You can drive a horse to drink, but you can't make him water. No, that's not quite how it goes. Stress and perfectionism. The intensity again. Not all gifted children are perfectionists. About 20% of them, maybe 30%, are perfectionistic. And I told the teachers earlier today, I've come to appreciate that perfectionism is not always bad. As a matter of fact, it's more like cholesterol. You have good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Well, same with perfectionism. I told them that I'm getting to the age where I have to think about when I have my stroke and that neurosurgeon's in there, I want a perfectionistic neurosurgeon. And you do too. You don't want someone who's going to say, oh, close him up, it's good enough. Perfectionism is good. So what's bad about perfectionism is when the child is paralyzed, when the child is so worried and uptight that they'll spend hours working on a project and then throw it away because they'd rather take a 0 than turn it something that's less than perfect. Or they can't take a risk because it'd be awful if they can't do it. And there's a book here by Dan Peters that I'm brand new and I really recommend on taming the worry monster. Actually, the title is Make Your Worrier a Warrior. But the stress and perfectionism, the whole issue of misdiagnosis I mentioned earlier, a lot of gifted children being incorrectly diagnosed, and then health and behavioral problems. Gifted children as a group have a higher incidence of asthma and allergies. And the more highly gifted they are, the more likely they are to have these. Amongst profoundly gifted children, it's about 70% have asthma and allergies, which is very high. And then one that we're calling reactive hypoglycemia, or temporary glucose insufficiency. And this is one I particularly wanted to spend a little time on tonight and make sure we covered, because it dramatically affects the behavior of about 10% of gifted children. Usually they're the more highly gifted, they're usually slender, and they show a behavior pattern like this. They go to school in the morning, they're eager they're intense, they want to learn, they're on task, they absorb information like a sponge. They're delightful, exhausting, but delightful to be around. They get along well with others. Everything's great until about 9 or 9:30 in the morning. And then in the space of about 30 minutes, all of a sudden, they have real difficulty staying on task, remembering things. Their attention span is short. They don't get along well with others. They're very impatient. They're very emotional. Even the slightest criticism and you have a meltdown. They're just a mess until about half an hour after lunch, and now they're back on task. A long attention span, give and take with other kids. They are great to be around until about 2:30 or 3, and then wham, someone pulled the plug. It's a scalloped pattern like that. Now, I'm just curious, if I could, with a show of hands, how many of you have kids that are like that? Looks like about 10%. What seems to be happening with these children is they're just running out of fuel. We have known for decades that in humans, the largest single consumer of glucose in the body is the brain. We know that. But there's research in the last 10 or 15 years that is showing that gifted children, when they are learning new information, their brains consume far more glucose than the brains of other kids. They're running out of fuel. If you have a child like that, now, of course, I always say to parents, talk it over with your physician. This is the CYA statement. You know, cover your alternatives. Isn't that what CYA means? Talk to your pediatrician or physician who will say, well, of course, that would be fine. Because what I'm recommending is a mid-morning snack and a mid-afternoon snack that's high protein. So, beef jerky at 9 o'clock, a cheese stick at 2 o'clock, or peanut butter crackers, and you see an immediate leveling out and a high level of functioning. That day, it's dramatic. Well, unless, out of that 10%, half are also going to have allergies. So now the beef jerky has to be without preservatives. It can't be peanut butter, it has to be soy. The cheese stick has to be a raw, unpasteurized goat cheese or something else. It's really hinky. It's very idiosyncratic. And these are usually the kids that you have to cut the tags out of the back of the shirt. And by the way, these are also tend to be the kids who are the normal short sleepers. With gifted children, about 20% of gifted children are normal short sleepers. That is, they get by very comfortably at age 6, 4, 5, 6, on 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. Therefore, parents need 18, 20 hours sleep a night. Now, I have to, though, again, do a Paul Harvey and tell you the rest of the story. About 20% need significantly more sleep than other kids. But this is a constellation. And the first time you go into your pediatrician or your counselor and say, well, I think she's hypoglycemic, and because we have to do this diet, and she's got these allergies, and I have to cut the tag out, and she has a normal short sleeper, and you see them roll their eyes and sigh a lot. No. It is a constellation, a syndrome, if you will, of this. Try it and see. Existential depression, this is one that you're going to see particularly in adolescence. These are the kids who are bright and idealists. Gifted children as a group, early in life, become quite concerned with fairness issues. They're concerned with what's happening in the world. They want justice and fairness and kindness. And they try to talk with their age peers who are much more concerned with Lady Antebellum or Lady Gaga or Miley Cyrus. And so these kids, as they get toward adolescence, they find themselves feeling alone and rather helpless in a strange world. And they go into a depression that focuses around, is this all there is to life? What's my life going to be like? Can I make a difference? It's an existential depression. I'm going to skip over the expectations of others. We may come back to it later because I want to focus on judgment lagging behind intellect, which is a really big deal. We're going to talk in a minute about asynchronous development, about gifted children. By asynchronous development, what I mean is they don't develop evenly in all areas, intellectually, but also their judgment lags behind their intellect. You may have an 8-year-old child who intellectually is like a 10, 12, or 14-year-old. Socially, emotionally, judgment-wise, that 8-year-old is going to be like a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old. It's at or a little bit ahead of their chronological age, but way behind their mental age. And the brighter the child, the greater the gap. Knowing this will help you understand why you find yourself saying so often, for someone so bright, you are so dumb. You have no common sense at all. Why do you do that? And I understand how frustrating it can be. I remember this mother telling me about her 5-year-old who they were standing in front of an elevator in LA. And people began coming up, and they got in the elevator, and the 5-year-old began looking at the people and saying, how much do you weigh? How much do you weigh? How much do you weigh? And the mother was horrified. Shh, that's rude. Why would you ask that? Mom, it says gross maximum allowable weight. He wanted to find out if that sucker would carry all of it. Intellectually, that made sense. But it was poor judgment. You don't ask people how much they weigh, do you? But do you see the lack of judgment behind intellect? Now, that's the bad news. The good news is, with each passing year, judgment will catch up to intellect. I always tell people about age 55, 60. I'm only half kidding because, you know, giftedness is not something you outgrow or get cured of at age 18. It carries on into adult life, and it has implications there, and you do see adults where their judgment lags behind their intellect fairly often. Okay, so here are the issues. First, school climate. You need to know that our schools are not set up to nurture gifted children particularly. Our schools really are set up to educate the population in general, and the focus is on basic minimal levels of competence. In fact, although on the one hand, you hear politicians and other leaders talk about, Lord knows we need our brightest minds, they're our nation's greatest resource. When you look at the support, what you find is that it's not there. Out of each federal dollar spent for education, less than 2 pennies are spent on educating our nation's greatest resource. Periodically, you get studies that come out showing how we're falling behind other countries. You periodically get studies showing that our brightest minds are underachieving dramatically in many areas. Why? It's because there are a lot of myths about gifted children, which we'll talk about in a minute there. But you mostly need to know about it, and as parents, you have to be the ones to advocate for our educational system. Teachers know what they could do in the classroom. but they can't advocate from within because it's not allowed. Their focus has to be on basic minimals levels of competence, and I hate to say this because it's a harsh statement, but I think it's true. In our schools today, mediocrity, conformity, and fitting in are more valued than innovation, excellence, and creativity. Well, except in athletics. Now that's a different story. In athletics, you have a very elitist group where the focus is on excellence. And I don't know why we don't adopt more of that kind of model for our academics. And I'm saying this as a former jock. I played my college football. I was lean and mean. I'm just mean now. But it needs to be said. The social and educational environment ties right in with this. The schools are only doing what we as a society demand of them. We've got to lobby our school boards and our administrators. And I know that parents of gifted children find themselves hesitant to do this because I've got a bright kid. Yes, you do have a bright kid who has special needs. So do focus, do lobby them. And I want to highlight the last one here. The studies of the most successful and eminent adults find that their education was different than what's being offered in most places. One of the books that has been the most influential to me recently is called Cradles of Eminence, the childhoods of more than 700 famous men and women, where when they looked at the childhoods, what they found was, as children, they all loved learning and read lots of books. They disliked school and disliked their teachers. Ouch. That was potent. These come from myths about gifted children. And these are the most common myths, that if they have high ability in one area, they're going to have high ability in other areas. Not necessarily. That's the asynchrony that we're going to talk about in a minute. That they're not aware of being different unless someone points it out. No, they are aware. They don't have a name for it, but they know that somehow they're different than others. That they're easy to parent. Yeah. That they're no different than other children because all children are, all children are not gifted. All children are special, but they're not all gifted. That's interesting. We're going to have more computer issues. There's also a lot of myths about parents, that parents of gifted children are pushy. No. And issue number 5 is perhaps one of the most important. That is, parents lack information about gifted children. Parents tell me repeatedly, they get a note home from the school saying, your child has been selected for the ACE program or the GATE program or the SNAG program or whatever it's called. And the parents look at that, look at their child and say, really? Particularly dads, I find. Dads have told me very often they think that their child must be an imposter and really doesn't belong in the gifted program. I mean, after all, she gets lost inside of a teacup. So what are the characteristics? Other parents say, well, I know what my child's like and she's bright, but is that what all gifted children are like? So I want to spend a little bit of time going over these characteristics. The first is that gifted children are usually highly verbal. Most gifted children start talking early. Most, but not all. Some actually start speaking late. But when they start speaking, it's in paragraphs and essays, and they really talk. However, are all gifted children highly verbal? No. I bet you know some people who are incredibly gifted mechanically, for example. Not particularly verbally. My airplane mechanic that I usually go to, this man is unbelievably gifted mechanically. He just looks at a machine and he knows how it works. For most of us, people like me, a wheelbarrow is a complicated piece of machinery. But not for him. He doesn't read the manual unless he has to. What I'm highlighting here is this asynchrony, that you can be gifted in different areas. Longer attention span and persistence on what he's interested in, not what you and I think he should be interested in. Maria knows more about Brazilian brown spiders than the good Lord intended anyone should know about Brazilian brown spiders. She can concentrate on that forever. Persistence. Now, her handwriting is mighty poor, and her spelling is even worse, and she doesn't want to learn math facts, but she's really persistent on anything that's a creepy crawling. The longer attention span is very important, and the persistence, for a couple of reasons. First, these are kids, if they are focused in their attention and persistence in areas other than what we're teaching, they're often seen as being unmotivated. Is Maria unmotivated? No. She's just not motivated where we want her to be. But maybe we can start where she is. You know, Maria, I thought of you this weekend. I saw this article in Nature magazine, and if you wrote the author, and I got the address here, you could get answers to those questions about South American insects and spiders that I don't know what they are. And make it look as grown up, because you don't want the kid stuff, you want the grown up. And I'll check your spelling, because that would blow it. You see what I did? I started where she was in the motivation that did exist, trying to get it to transfer to other areas. She's not unmotivated. She's just not motivated where you and I want her to be. The other on the attention span is as a way of sorting out, is this ADHD or is this gifted? A child who truly has ADHD has great difficulty maintaining folks' attention for long periods of time on anything. Well, except TV and computer games. Those are just so quick moving that even a child with ADHD can be pretty riveted. By contrast, a gifted child has no problem maintaining folks' attention for long periods of time on what he or she's interested in. So you find the attention problems in the gifted child being only in some situations, but not others. With the ADHD child, you see it at school, at home, at church, at scouts, playground, and so forth. So it's a real important way of considering this. Somehow I did that again. Intensity. Of all the characteristics of gifted children, this is the most universal and yet the most overlooked. I'll say more about it later. The wide range of interest is the typical pattern, but not universal. There are inborn temperament differences, like Maria, who just from whenever she loved creepy crawlies. She has tunnel vision. For most gifted children, though, they're what I call the grasshoppers of life. They jump from leaf to leaf to leaf. Now, whatever leaf they're on, they are as intensely involved in as the leaf before. until they jump to the next leaf and forget about the one before. It's why I tell parents, rent the clarinet, don't buy it. Now, they usually end up coming back to these interests later on. Strong curiosity, limitless questions, particularly in preschoolers. Mothers tell me their ears just get tired. They like to put things together or take things apart in unusual ways, and sometimes it can be things like your fishing reel or your DVD player. You don't necessarily appreciate it. They teach themselves how to read and write before entering school. And that's not why their handwriting is so poor. Their handwriting is so poor for two other reasons. The first is that their thoughts simply go so much faster than their little hands can manage. And the second reason is they don't see any particular reason for it. If you can read what I write, and I can read what I write, and the purpose of writing is to communicate, does it really have to be calligraphy? It's kind of like the same thing with spelling. Why do I need to learn spelling? I've got spell check on my computer. I've got grammar check on my computer. And you find yourself stuck in error. Unusually good memory. You don't have to look up telephone numbers. You ask your 8-year-old. And I'm sorry to tell you, an unusual sense of humor, particularly puns. I tell people I consider puns to be a hard diagnostic sign of gifted. If you see it in a youngster under the age of about 12, the humor is not always appreciated in the classroom, by the way. And then in younger gifted children, particularly ages 8 and below, they love to organize people and things in these games that they invent, which are complicated games that have rules within rules within rules, and then exceptions to the rules. And they try and organize the other first graders who don't even understand the game, much less the rules. And there are tears and feelings are hurt, and you get comments like, you know, your daughter is very bossy. This just is part and parcel of the gifted personality. And by the way, with gifted girls, Barbara Kerr, who wrote Smart Girls, helped me understand something, and that is that when she studied eminent adults and eminent women and looked at their childhoods, what she found was almost all of them were not the stereotypic sweet, polite little girls that you expect. They were characterized by thorns or shells. They spent large amounts of alone time, and they were prickly to be around. And that is just part of apparently what's necessary for them to A, have the time to develop their abilities, and B, the prickliness to not buy into what other people think. Now, they don't care a whole lot, but that's necessary. So if you have a girl like that, don't expect her to be the sweet stereotypic. She may, but she very likely will not. And then imaginary playmates. Now, imaginary playmates, parents worry a lot about, even though most kids have imaginary playmates. However, gifted children don't usually have just one. They're more likely to have 5 or 8. And the imaginary playmates have imaginary pets, and they live in an imaginary universe. Parents worry, am I not providing enough stimulation? Is this why? Is it a sign of mental illness? No. As long as your child can give and receive affection, imaginary playmates is associated only with level of brightness and creativity, particularly creativity. And imaginary playmates usually disappear upon birth of a sibling or entering school. Now, I know it can be embarrassing going to a restaurant and having them set 3 extra places, but no, they'll go away. Now, then there are 4 factors, though, that really influence these characteristics, and this is what I want you to particularly get to. The level of giftedness, asynchronous development, Dubowski's overexcited abilities, thinking, learning styles, and the higher the child's overall ability, the more these four factors come into play. First is the level of gifted. I mentioned earlier, I don't like the term gifted because it implies they're the same. At the very least, you have the borderline gifted, the average gifted, the profoundly gifted, and the terminally gifted. You know, you've got this incredible range, and those folks in the upper parts, they are just different from I call them the garden variety gifted. Those are the highly, profoundly gifted are ones who are going to have most particular issues. And if you have a kid in that range, I strongly recommend that you look into the Davidson Institute for Talent Development. They focus particularly nationwide on providing services to them. The asynchronous development, I shared this with the teachers earlier. You know, most of us, as we went along, we somehow learned that if someone is this bright in this area, let's say math, we expect other areas, English, spatial ability, to be pretty similar. And that's true for people in the average, below average, or even slightly above average range. However, once you get higher than that into the gifted, highly gifted, very highly, the higher you go up, what happens typically is there is an increasing span in abilities in different areas. So you may have a child who's 8 years old, but reading at a level that's like a 14-year-old, math ability that's like a 10-year-old, visual spatial ability like a 9-year-old, and judgment like an 8-year-old. Can you see the span? Now think of, where would you put that kid in educationally? What class would you put him in? Well, probably there's no one class that's going to be needed, going to be working for him. This is a child who has asynchronous development and probably will need a combination of educational placements. May need whole grade skip combined with single subject acceleration, combined with cluster grouping in the classroom, but also getting remedial tutoring in an area. Wow, that's a challenge. This is where parents need information. If you suspect you have a child who has asynchronous development, you probably are going to need to get some good test data and come in and advocate with the school, really pushing to say, we don't know. I understand you have a gifted program. It's a cluster grouping. I understand you have a gifted program. It's called differentiation. That may work for many gifted children, but we're talking an asynchronous gifted child. So you may need several different, and there's a book, Academic Advocacy, I think, that we have here that may help you on that. But this is a visual portrayal. This is an old Wechsler intelligence scale for children face sheet. The intelligence scale has a variety of different subscales, some in the verbal area, some in the nonverbal area. This is average range. This is mentally retarded. The upper red is the gifted range. You look at this kid and, wow, he's clearly gifted. I mean, you look at those and almost all of the areas are really, matter of fact, there are 3 of them he knocked the top out of. He has a ceiling effect. He's brighter than the test measures. How much brighter? Don't know. The test doesn't go that high. But then there are 2 areas, gosh, they're not quite gifted. Matter of fact, one of them is only average. This is a kid who is gifted but also is functionally LD, learning disabled. You can have children who are gifted and learning disabled. And as parents, you need to be particularly alert to this because of the asynchronous development. Now, I understand that many schools still have a one label per customer policy. You can be either gifted or LD, but not both. But you are going to have to advocate for this because these kids are at risk. They're at risk for underachieving, and they're at risk for low self-concept. Why? Because, like all the rest of us, they tend to evaluate their mental ability not based on what they can do, but based on what they cannot do. I don't know why people think I'm so bright. I mean, I'm 10 years old and I can do calculus. Matter of fact, I can do it in my head. I love it. It's easy. But I can't spell. I'm not very bright. I mean, calculus it's a snap. Anyone could, you could do it if you really wanted to. It's fun. It's a snap. It's easy. It's easy for me. I grew up seeing the world through my eyes. To me, that's normal. That's average. Doesn't everyone love calculus? Doesn't everyone find it easy? But I can't spell. So I discount what I can do, and I focus on what I cannot do. Low self-esteem, I lower my expectations. The asynchronous development. I have to end in just a minute here. Thinking and learning styles, I just have to get to through these four, though. Kids don't always think in the same fashion. Gifted kids, the differences are quite dramatic. Some gifted children are highly auditory sequential. They're verbal, precise, orderly, logical, structured. Place for everything, everything in its place. Very different than the visual spatial learners. Visual spatial learners tend to be disorganized, or seemingly disorganized. Their rooms are in a disaster area. They lose their homework. They always are getting creative with things. They don't want to be bothered with facts. However, each of these thinking and learning styles can be equally gifted, but the visual spatial are less likely to be identified as gifted. They're more likely to get in power struggles and more likely to be misdiagnosed as ADHD. Now, the auditory sequentials, they're a different set of risks. They're more at risk for perfectionism. They're more likely to be the nerds. And I always tell people these days that there's a large group of nerds that I don't worry about like I used to. They're the nerds that come from the nerd families. You know, mama's a nerd, daddy's a nerd, granddaddy was a nerd. They've got this tradition of nerdism that goes back for generations and models of how nerdism can work for you. So I don't worry about them. I do worry about the others, the ones who are kind of nerdy and get misdiagnosed as Asperger's disorder and the like. But the final thing that I want to, and we're not going to get through the 11 points, so you're just going to have to email me and get those overheads there. But the Dabrowski overexcitabilities, because if you took nothing else home from tonight, I want you to take this home. Years ago, a Polish psychologist and psychiatrist named Kazimierz Dabrowski came up with a theory, the key part of which is the overexcitabilities, where he built on something that we've known for centuries. And that is whenever a child, any child, is born, that child comes in innately instinctually drawn to stimuli, drawn to lights, to taste, to touch, to movement. We know that. But what Dabrowski noted was the brighter the child, the more that child tended toward being really excited, such that it became an over-excitability. And he then said, but this also can be in any one or more of 5 areas. The first is an intellectual over-excitability. These are the inquiring minds that just consume books. You get a hernia carrying the books from the library. They read so much. It's like this one book we have. Some of my best friends are books. They want you to make up, can you make up 5 more math problems for me? They're such fun. They think a lot. Then you have the imaginational overexcitability. These are the ones the drama queens. These are the ones who are often fantasy, imagination, daydreaming. Then you have the emotional overexcitability. This is where the sensitivity comes in. These are the gifted kids who can't watch the evening news without crying, or want to pick up the homeless man because he has no place to stay. Or who, I'll tell you the story I told the teachers this morning, a true story, or this afternoon. Mother driving her 9-year-old to a dance lesson, and the daughter said, "Mom, please slow down. But honey, we're going to be late." I know, Mom, but we're killing bugs on the windshield. And I've seen too much death for someone my age. True story about this exquisite sensitivity that in the long run is going to be a wonderful boon to her, but right now can be quite a problem. Then you have the psychomotor overexcitability. And these are the youngsters who are always moving. They have twitches, they have to jiggle something or other. And of course, they're likely to be incorrectly diagnosed as ADHD. But it's not that they're off topic. As a matter of fact, the more on topic they are, the more excited they are, the more they just have to twitch because it feels so good. And then the final one is a sensual overexcitability. And I know that you parents of adolescents are getting big-eyed right now. But these are the kids who have to touch everything or everybody. Or the tags that I mentioned. Fluorescent lights, odors, that perfume is wonderful, but I'm about to be sick from it. It's just so overpowering. The brighter the child, the more likely the child is to have 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of the overexcitabilities, which in the long run will be their biggest strength in life. That's what's going to fuel their motivation, fuel their fire, to allow them to develop their potential and to fall in love with an idea that they can give their life to. And that's what we want. On the other hand, it's going to be Achilles' heel because people will tend to criticize them for this. Now, we started out with a simple notion of gifted. We've talked about the framework within which gifted children are, but then I've added on some other things. Gifted children encompass